Hello, welcome to Explorations in Economic History. And this is Stalin's Rise and the Tragedy of Collectivization, an overview of what collectivization was and what the results were. Now, Stalin is today obviously considered quite extreme. Stalinism is considered a very extreme policy, and it's assumed that Stalin, from the beginning, wanted to force collectivization and did not mind being a tyrant in order to achieve what he wanted to achieve, which many assume is power. He wanted to become the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. However, at the time, in 1928 and early 1929, Stalin's views were actually quite moderate. So, for example, Stalin argued that Bukharin's advocacy of a free market to encourage the peasants to sell their surplus was too capitalist and was equally harmful to the policy of the new economic policy as the more extreme compulsion that was advocated by the left. So he was taking a middle road position, and at the time this was considered moderate by people in the party. And at this time, Stalin did not argue for compulsion for collectivization. He argued that collectivization should only happen as the peasants wanted to voluntarily join the movement for collectivization. And so Stalin said, NEP means the freedom of the market within certain limits, but safeguarded by the regulating role of the state. And again, this was a moderate position. He argued that for NEP to work, there had to be there couldn't be complete free play of prices, as he said, on the market, as is normal in capitalist countries, but there had to be some amount of price movement. Two sides must remain. The side directed against the more extreme war communist positions, which were, complete, full collectivization, complete, full socialization of everything, and on the other side, force against the complete freedom of trade. So for NEP to work, there had to be a prevention of too much of an extreme movement towards markets, and also too much of an extreme movement towards full socialization. So Stalin was a moderate. And this is also shown by the differences between Stalin and Bukharin, or rather the lack of differences. So Stalin did not differ from Bukharin on either their views on collectivization or on their views of free markets. It was actually their approach to how to deal with the peasants that was the main difference between the two. So Stalin argued that given a sufficient amount of supervision, the experiment that had been started under war communism could be repeated again and more successfully. So he believed that the state, if it could supervise the peasants and could help the peasants to take the right decisions, then the war communism experiment could be repeated now in 1928, when they had had a period of new economic policy and had advanced somewhat, and it could be successful. Whereas Bukharin was concerned that the peasants were not going to voluntarily join the experiment, and that the state was too weak to be able to encourage that experiment along. So the state was stronger now in 1928 than it had been under war communism, and so Stalin believed that it would be possible, and it is unlikely, so historians say, that he actually planned to use the full power of the state to coerce the peasants, as actually occurred. That was done more out of expediency and necessity, given the conditions, given the response that the peasants actually had. What was it that actually forced the collectivization forward as a coercive policy as opposed to a voluntary policy, or as opposed to waiting and not forcing the collectivization through? Well, the 1929 crop was good. The harvest was good. It was not a matter of a drought in 1929. It was the grain procurement that fell short. So to support the industrial plan, which was very ambitious, agriculture had to be made to give up enough of its produce to guarantee the possibility of industrial development. So they needed a lot of grain to be procured in order to support the industrial plan. And they did shut down markets to prevent the peasants from selling their grain at higher prices in the private markets. But it was not markets, but the ineptitude of government agencies that made the targets unattainable. So historians say, and it shows in the official documents of the time, that it was not a matter of the peasants selling the grain in markets that was the main problem, or black markets and so forth. It was the ineptitude of government agencies that made the targets unattainable. And interestingly, it wasn't only private peasants who were hoarding grain. So one of the big problems that government pointed to at the time for the lack of procurement of the grain surpluses was hoarding. So if peasants produced a lot of grain, but then they hid it in their cellar, then this prevented the government from procuring enough grain to fulfill the planned targets. However, it wasn't only individual peasants. So there were several problems, major problems that prevented the procurement, and that included wagons full of rotting wheat, and lack of storage and transport in other facilities. But there was also the problem of hoarding grain or hiding their stores away. And the kolkhozy and sovkhozy, those are the collective farms and the state farms, were when they were alarmed at the amount of grain collection that were being demanded, they hid their stores. And they were actually the worst offenders in fulfilling their quotas. But again, the problem of the lack of storage and transport were continually remarked upon by the collective farmers and the peasants, and there were rotting grain in railways in places where it had not been delivered to the state, and this was a major part of the grain fulfillment problem. And there were other serious problems where the state fell short in its role of procurement and planning. So, for example, there were shortages in key areas of natural resources like coal. So there was a sharp drop in coal production, which caused shortages, and the shortages in coal and other resources like this caused shortages in the industries dependent upon it. So, for example, iron and steel were reliant upon coal, and so there were shortages then in the iron and steel industries. And those shortages caused an interruption in production in all the industries that used them, and in turn the industries that relied on those industries. So it went down the line and caused actual grinding of factories to a halt in their production, for example. So without an automatic regulator and without the ability for producers to substitute or to change their price based on these shortages, which would occur in a market system but could not occur under planning, where they were told what to, specifically not only what to use in their production, but from whom to obtain it, and so forth, and were not allowed to change their method of production, and were not allowed to change their prices in order to prioritize who only those who are willing to pay the higher price to use those resources would use it. Instead, they couldn't change their price, so it could be used wastefully where someone would have been able to make a substitution, and so on. So spiraling down through the line, there was work stoppage and so forth due to these shortages, and this actually aggravated the famine that was already beginning to start. And in conditions of the threat of famine, it was actually, really horrible to know that there were hundreds of wagons full of grain that were just standing there rotting all over the country. And so in response, there were peasant revolts, and the revolts were particularly bad because the grain that was brutally confiscated from them was rotting on these trains and so forth, for lack of storage space and for lack of proper transport and so on. So an official gave a report which stated unequivocally that it was the procurements which produced the revolts, not actually the idea of collectivization itself. It was more that too much grain was being seized from them and then was actually rotting for lack of storage space. So it was these problems in procurement, these problems in planning, the inability for the state to actually do what it was supposed to do, and its brutality in seizing so much from the individuals and from the collective farms, and then its just utter uselessness, leaving the grain to rot. This is what caused the revolts. This is what caused the peasants to be so against the policy. And in turn, in response, the state then forced through collectivization, using it often as a punitive measure against the peasants who were hoarding their grain or who were refusing to go along with what the state asked of them. And that's why they were forced to collectivize, so that the state could be assured of being able to seize the grain. And the result of all of this, the consequences of the forced collectivization, was actually a dramatic drop in livestock that was actually worse than what happened in World War II or in the drought of 1946. So it was actually the forced collectivization produced worse results than even a horrible wartime period like World War II. So you can see in this graph here, in this graphic, that in 1928, the total amount plus the individual amounts of these livestock, of horses, sheep, pigs, and cows, and you can see the fall to 1941 before World War II, and in 1950 again falling, and only in the late 1950s did the Soviet farm stocks actually begin to approach the 1928 pre-collectivization levels again. The Soviet government, of course, did not take full responsibility for causing the problems that led to this drop in both farm animals and in grain procurements and so on. Instead, it was always counter-revolutionary wrecking, which included things like hoarding and sabotage, that was to blame, and sometimes bureaucracy. But again, this wasn't an argument that they had, expanded the role of the state too much or something. It was just, people were allowing themselves to be bureaucratic. And so they tried to use self-criticism and so forth to overcome it, and just said, there's too much bureaucracy here. It's so-and-so who's to blame. It's this official and that official who are to blame for this bureaucracy, as opposed to looking at the system itself. So one question to ask ourselves is, were symptoms rather than underlying causes being blamed? And so, if so, what were the underlying causes that should have been blamed? And could these have been addressed without giving up this the dream that they had and the system that they hoped to put into place, and the utopian vision that they hoped to come out of that system? Could these issues have been addressed? Could people have learned from mistakes and found a way to bring about socialism? Or was the underlying problem the idea of socialism to begin with? So these are important questions to look at and to say, what were the underlying problems, or what were the issues that caused this inability to procure the grain? Why was transport, falling so short of what was needed? And why was the grain sitting out in the sunshine? Was it just merely a matter of not having the right tools and materials? Should they have imported more from abroad? Was it a problem of